Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I want us to get started by going on an adventure together. So if you will you please come with me to the wine store? Okay, we're gonna visualize. Oh good, I got some volunteers. All right, so let's go to the wine store. So let's visualize. So we're going to a new wine store. We open the door, and can you picture it? It's new, you see these aisles with sparkly bottles. There's pretty labels like Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. Are you there with me? Yeah, okay. So imagine we're right there, we're about to take a step, we're deciding where to go explore, and somebody taps you on the shoulder. Excuse me, but I come here a lot, and this is the wine you should buy. It's the best one here. Weird, right? Feels weird? This person, as we like to say, does not know us from Adam, right? Does not know our budget, doesn't know our preferences. Are we looking for a bold red? Are we looking for a crisp white? Maybe we don't even drink. Maybe we're just getting some champagne for the birthday party that we've been asked to get supplies for. This person doesn't know. So how weird for them to come over and tell us what to purchase right away. That would feel weird, right? And yet, we have this happen to us all the time. In the real world, this happens to us all the time, where somebody who doesn't know our background, our goals, our budgets, whether we like red or white wine, decides that they would like to give us some advice. This happens to us all the time. Now I want you to imagine if you went back to that wine store again and again, and that happened every time you went. So every time you went to this beautiful wine store, you could barely get a few steps in before somebody kind of stopped you and said, wait, this one, you should get this one, without asking you any questions about you or your goals or your background. How would you feel? As you got close to that door and knew that that was going to maybe happen, how would you feel inside?
I wouldn't go back.
Right? Would you go back? Would you go back? Yeah. So what I want us to think about today as we're talking about advice is kind of that feeling. So I started researching this a couple years ago. And the reason is I was addicted to advice. I really was. Like, you could find me in the self-help section of any bookstore. If you met me at a networking event, I'd be like, hey, what's your name? What did you wish you knew 10 years ago? Just completely addicted to advice. I was at a point in my life where I really wanted some feedback, some guidance, and so advice was my ticket. And I'm sorry to say, it took me a while. It took me a few years before I realized that that wasn't working. It took me a few years before I realized that some of the advice wasn't helpful. Some of it was just downright bad. And it took me a few years to realize how it was making me feel to receive so much advice all the time. And it wasn't until I kind of stopped and reflected that I realized a lot of times it made me feel small. It didn't make me feel good at all. So I decided to do something that a lot of us do when there's a problem. I was going to do a detox, an advice detox. So I tried to do an advice detox. I had to stay away from the self-help section, right? No more self-help books. Sorry, Audible. I tried to stop asking that question at networking events and stop seeking advice. And what I found was the advice would get to me anyway. So that's when I started doing this research. I was actively trying not to receive advice anymore. I was on my detox. And yet, I was finding that advice was still getting to me. People were still offering me advice. So I started to do some research, and that's really what I want to share with you today. The biggest thing, if you take away one thing from this, what I found in my research is, y'all, I think we get way too much freaking advice. I do. I think we get way too much advice. You can quote me on this, I promise. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is to try to illustrate this point. Not just about the quantity, though, but about why this matters. Why it matters that we get too much advice, what that can do to us. I'm going to try to talk with you today about what it can do to our confidence and even our stress level. And what I'm hoping is I can share some things that you'll take with you that maybe help you look at advice in a different way, in a new way. I I first want to talk to you about this finding. When I looked at where the advice is happening, I found a key thing. Men may be more likely to offer women unsolicited advice than women are to offer men unsolicited advice. So men are more likely to give unsolicited advice to women than women are to give it to men. But overall, women receive more unsolicited advice from men or from women than men do. So we're less likely to offer it to men, but we're receiving overall more advice. A couple studies that helped me come to this conclusion. So one was done at the University of Pennsylvania, and this researcher spent 3 months looking at the interactions between first-year students and staff in a co-ed dorm. And over 3 months, that 3-month observation period, she found 197 tokens or examples of unsolicited advice being passed around from person to person. When she looked at that from a gender perspective, focusing on how the students would talk to each other, she found that the male first-year students accounted for 25% of those tokens by giving advice to the female students. So 25% of those tokens, male students giving advice to female students. Any thoughts on the percent for females giving advice to males? Just think in your head. 5%. So 25% of it was males giving advice to females, 5% giving advice to males. Another interesting finding from this study, though. So in this co-ed dorm, there were a couple staff members, like an RA, a resident advisor, or a graduate fellow, a couple staff members. The researcher looked at how often the students, these first-year students, would give unsolicited advice to a staff member. Found examples of that from the male students. Did not find many examples of that from the female students, of those students giving advice up to the staff. There was another study that kind of showed me the same thing. So this one was more recent, and it was done at Harvard, and it looked at this phenomenon of kids, children, and adolescents giving advice to their parents. Now this was called upward advice transmission, which is a real fancy word for what us parents know is like our kids thinking they know what's best when they probably don't, right? So these researchers were looking at that phenomenon, and what they wanted to understand was just that phenomenon itself, but also what were the trends there. They found 2 things that I thought were relevant for our conversation today. One, don't think this will surprise you. When the kids were offering this upward advice transmission to the parents, it wasn't at the parents' request. It was overwhelmingly unsolicited advice, okay? So when the parents are getting this advice from the kids, it's overwhelmingly unsolicited. But the second thing, they found that mothers were more likely to get this kind of advice than fathers. Yeah. So in this study, as we look at that, we see again that gender piece coming up and showing us who's giving, who's receiving more advice. Now, the reason I want to bring this up, it's not just to focus on gender, but it really helps me to understand this concept of advice. This is not neutral. There are power structures at play here. So I started trying to look into that a little bit, and I found some more interesting information. So there was a study done in 2018. It was Duke and Harvard and a couple other universities, and they were looking at the idea that interpersonal relationships can activate feelings of power. And they wanted to look at that specifically in the context of unsolicited advice. So that activated feeling of power with unsolicited advice. And what they found is that offering advice makes you feel influential over others and power within yourself, even if that advice is not taken. Just the act of offering advice is enough to make you feel influence over others and power within yourself. And the researchers found that more is better. The more advice you offer, the more powerful you feel. They also found that those who seek power will sometimes use offering advice as a way to feel that sense of power. Now, this wasn't the only study where I found this mentioned. There was another one done just last year. And this one was looking at the workplace specifically and how employees perceive solicited advice and unsolicited advice. So like advice you asked for and advice you didn't. And in that study, the key finding was that the employees felt like the advisor benefited from offering unsolicited advice more than the advisees benefited from receiving it. So these employees are looking at these instances of unsolicited advice, and they're seeing that this advisor benefits more from sharing it than an advisee would benefit from receiving it. Whew, right? I mean, when I started researching some of this, I have to tell you, I was surprised. I was experiencing some of this, and I think it's why I wanted to take this advice detox and try to learn more, but I was really surprised to see it called out in the research in this way. And it also inspired me to think about, one, how it's different for everyone, to think about how everyone might be experiencing this phenomenon differently. But then two, I got curious. I wanted to know for myself, like, where does this show up for me? Where am I receiving advice? Who is it coming from? So I want to invite you to kind of go on that same reflection journey with me. So together we can consider this question of, where do we receive advice? Is it when we're out in public with our kids? Is it when we're at work? Where do we offer advice? Where do we find that we're most comfortable offering advice? Which relationships do we find in our lives that activate this the most? Is it different within friend circles or work circles? If you've ever tried being pregnant in public, then you know what it's like to get unsolicited advice. I was once in like kind of an open, like co-working type area, talking to somebody very pregnant, and I was eating a piece of chocolate, and this man that I did not know kind of came running over and was like, "Chocolate has caffeine," which is kind of like, okay, you know, like, and you know, if you have your own examples of the kinds of advice people give you when you're pregnant, a lot of them are terrible like that and very intrusive. But I think we can even say just having anybody, pregnant or not, in public makes you kind of vulnerable to comments. Have you ever had like a stranger or even like a not so close acquaintance tell you about a diet you should try, or a fitness routine that you have to try, or a food that you have to eat or stop eating, or a meditation that you have to do, or any of those things? I mean, it is incredible the kind of unsolicited feedback that we're open to just by being out in the world. So what I want to strongly encourage is this idea of reflection. Where has this shown up for you? What pieces of feedback do you remember? So as you reflect on that, another thing again is to think about it in different spaces. So not just at work, not just at home, but where does it show up in different spaces? One of the reasons I really want to encourage this is because, as we're going to talk about in the next section, there are really interesting things that happen to us when we receive advice. I think women are amazing. We make every space we go into better. I mean, countless study shows that if you have an area where it's predominantly male and it slowly shifts to include more females, things get better. Just across the board, things get better. So if we can better understand this phenomenon and deal with it and not let it be a barrier, I feel like it's one of those rising tide, raises all boats, fix the world kind of solutions. So the first thing I want to bring up, and this is, did anyone take like an intro to psychology class in college? Okay, a couple people. So let's see, this is like a throwback. There was this theory in the 60s that was really, really popular. It was Jack Brim, and it was the psychological reactance. Psychological reactance. Does it ring a bell with anyone? So it's this idea that as people, we have a perception about our own freedoms and our own freedoms to do different behaviors. So me as a person out in the world, I have certain freedoms. I can do certain behaviors. And this theory says that if you do something to make me feel like my behaviors are more limited, my freedoms are more limited, that I'm going to react. I'm gonna try to do what I can to get that freedom back. I really like to think about my toddler in this scenario. So my toddler really hates his high chair, loves eating, really hates his high chair. Because his high chair is one of those 2021 super safe 5-point harness high chairs, right? And as soon as we put him in that thing, it doesn't matter what food we put on the tray, he's like trying to get out of it, right? That's what I think of when I think of this theory. It's this idea that if we restrict someone's perception of what freedoms they have, that they're going to react. And here's why I want to bring this up. There was a recent study done at Duke that looked at the connection between this theory of reactance and unsolicited advice. And it was so interesting, it found that if you offer someone unsolicited advice that they feel like it constricts their freedoms, what they want to do, they are maybe going to do the opposite of whatever you told them. Doesn't matter if it's good for them or not, they're going to do the opposite because they want that freedom back. Now, we know the reverse of this as reverse psychology, right? It's like when I tell my 7-year-old, don't eat too much broccoli, you'll have way too much energy and then you'll be up all night, right? That's a reverse psychology where we tell them to do the opposite thing. So this tells us when you give someone unsolicited advice and it maybe goes against what they were thinking about doing, they're gonna react, see that as a threat to their personal freedoms and maybe do the opposite. Now, fascinating, and if we were gonna write a book on psychology, we could maybe go deeper into that. But I wanna kind of stop, not do too deep of a dive on that, and just highlight, do we see here that this is our bodies, our minds reacting to unsolicited advice as a threat? This situation it's a threat to my freedoms. What an interesting perspective. When we talk about advice, a lot of times we talk about it like it's a gift. Let me give you some advice, like it's a present. This is not our brains reacting like advice is a present, right? I mean, let's go back to our wine store from the beginning. Did it feel like a present when that person presented us with a wine bottle and told us that that was what we needed to buy before they had even asked us any questions about what we were looking for? No. And so this idea that it could be perceived as a threat is fascinating. And there are some additional studies to bring this to light. I love this because how often in research can you quote the term butting in? But there was a study that found a lot of people interpret the unsolicited advice as this threat of they're being judged, someone is butting in on their lives. And the impact of this is even stronger if you're not close with that person, so if it's a stranger. There was another really fascinating one that showed that we experience unsolicited advice. We have a stress response to that experience. It's like a psychophysical, we feel it as stress. Now I want us to think about this together for a second. Everybody experiences stress differently. What does your body do when you feel stress? Kind of think for a second. I know for me, my heart will beat really fast or my palms will get sweaty. Can you picture your body as you feel stress? Now imagine someone's uninvited advice could do that to you, could trigger that response in you. I would even say, based on this research, likely does trigger that response for you. It is crazy to think that we are just out navigating the world, trying to get things done, and that we could be interrupted by this kind of unsolicited advice that we know now is not necessarily a gift, a present. Let me give you some advice. This is an opportunity for our bodies to react strongly. It reminds me a lot of, have we heard the term fight or flight? I like to ask people this question. If somebody pops out from behind the door, boo, how do you react? Have you seen the videos where it happens in the haunted houses and the guy punches them? That would be the fight response, right? I proved that I probably couldn't be alive in any other century but this one. If someone popped out from behind that door and scared me right now, I would crumble to the floor. Does not matter if I tried to do karate for the rest of my life, I think that would still be my reaction. Somebody pops out from behind that door, I will crumble to the ground. Everybody reacts to it differently. If it's fight or flight, I possum. Just play dead. It's my response. And so it's really interesting to me as I think about my stress response. When somebody offers me unsolicited advice that I feel like is them butting in or judging me, sometimes I do freeze. It's like my brain even freezes. I'm not able to think, process, respond. It's really difficult for me to shut that down. And so as you think about what your stress response looks like, it's interesting to imagine as you're receiving unsolicited advice in the workplace, at home, is that stress response happening to you? What is it disrupting? Now, another piece, we've talked a lot about unsolicited advice, but I don't want to forget solicited advice. There was a study done that showed simply asking, soliciting advice, asking for advice, can actually lower your confidence. The simple act of asking for advice can lower your confidence. And so we're not just talking about unsolicited advice. We really want to look at the effects of all kinds of advice. And I think this one is really important to me because if many of you have worked with folks who are younger, who are maybe junior level, who are coming in, you have to ask for advice a lot when you're starting out, right? It's just part of the game. So we see this study, we don't say, stop asking for advice. Sometimes we need help, right? What we want to recognize maybe is what is it like for that person who's already feeling junior, already feeling new, already trying to navigate a new space, probably feeling a lot of stress related to those things, and now asking for advice is maybe also lowering their confidence. And remember, what happens to us when we give advice? Did you see me grow taller? We feel a sense of power, we feel a sense of influence, so we're feeling better, they're maybe feeling less confident. And so if you're in a position where you're in a leadership position, a management position, even as a parent, recognizing that part of your role there as an advisor maybe isn't just to answer their question or provide that advice, but also to help manage their confidence, remind them what they already know, right? Remind them what they're already doing well. Remind them if there are any other things they've done that could help them answer that question. Ask them some questions first. Ask them what they think. Because if they get to share advice, how do they feel, right? So I bring this up because, again, we want to think about how our bodies are reacting in these in these advice situations. And what I hope I've shared with you today is that it's really not neutral, and it's not a small thing. Has anyone here read this book, The Confidence Code? Okay, a couple people. So this is an incredible book. These two authors, Katie Kay and Claire Shipman, they look at this phenomenon of women, even just women at the highest possible level, not feeling confident. And a lot of the research they do looks into why, and it even looks at, is the female brain like different than the male brain? Because like the males are real confident in a lot of these situations. They bring up a lot of these studies. Have you seen the study that says that if a female doesn't hit all the job requirements, she doesn't apply? But if the male hits like 6 out of 10, he will. So they bring up a lot of those kinds of studies, and they're like, is there a difference in our brains? Like, what is going on? And what they end up coming to, part of the conclusion is that a lot of confidence has to do with quick decision making, just being decisive, being able to, in a room, being able to say, yep, I think we should go this way. And they talk a lot about why they don't think that's easy for women, why women might struggle to do that quickly, to be confident in decision making. I don't think it has to do with a lot of the differences in our brain, the biology of it, the sizes of it. I think it has to do a lot with our environments. How did we come up as women? I feel like if I reflect back on how I was raised, there were a lot of opportunities for me to be invited to look outward. How can I help others, right? How can I support others? That trait of empathy, being humble, always kind of crediting others, not just ourselves for our work. So there's a lot of scanning, right? Kind of knowing what's going on in the environments around us. And they talk about that and how if as women we're doing a lot of that scanning, wondering how others are doing, seeing how we can help, it's really hard for us to then be quick on decision making. And if you weren't having to do all that, if you had all that kind of turned off and you were just focused on you, focused on what you were doing, it'd be a heck of a lot easier to make some of those decisions, wouldn't it? I kind of compare it to like, how many browser tabs do you have open? I feel like my mind has 100 browser tabs open a lot of times, right? In the context of confidence, let's reintroduce this idea of advice. Okay, so now we're back in the workplace. As women, a lot of times we're kind of scanning the environment, we're facing outward, very focused on helping, empathy, being humble. Now we're also receiving advice, potentially making us less confident, making us feel judged. It adds another layer. I think it adds a really important part to this discussion about our ability to be confident and to be able to make decisions, to show others that we're confident by our ability to make quick decisions. If advice is another thing we have to think about, another thing that affects how we're doing at work, at home, whatever environment we're in, then it does have the potential to disrupt, to keep us from feeling confident, to keep us from being able to have that confident decision making. So when I talk about advice literacy, it's that same idea of media literacy. I want to understand, I want to stay curious about the source of this advice. This helps me do a couple things. One, it helps take the focus off me a little bit. So remember how I told you if somebody surprised me at that door, I'd crumble and be on the floor? Happens very fast for me. If I can slow down my reactions a little bit, that helps me to not have that fight or flight stress response to unsolicited advice. With advice literacy, I'm staying curious. And by staying curious, I'm not in a threat, stress, response kind of framework. I'm in a, I would like to know more about this person kind of framework. Some of the questions that I use when I ask this are things like, who is this person? What is their relevant expertise? What kind of stake do they have? This one is really important to me. Will it affect them if this advice does or doesn't work out? And also the third one, how are they feeling right now? This one really has to do a lot with the research that we shared today. How are they feeling right now? Could this advice make them be feeling better about themselves? Is this maybe more about them than me? These are some of the questions that I consider really important to advice literacy. This idea that we can do some work to understand the source, that we can do some work to take the focus off of us and hyper-focusing on whatever this person has shared with us, usually unsolicited, and put the focus back on them. So let's try this together. Let's say that, we're eating this lovely dinner that was brought for us for the event tonight, and you're kind of snacking away, and somebody says, "That's so interesting. So do you eat cheese? Have you ever tried not eating cheese? I stopped eating cheese, and it's really helped my skin. You should try it." Who is this person? Let's say in this example that this person is a stranger. What is their relevant expertise? Don't think they're a cheesemonger or a nutritionist. Okay, we don't know that that's their background. We could ask. That could be our response. Oh, that's interesting. Was that advice from a nutritionist, or did you just read about that on Facebook, or right? So we could ask, what kind of stake do they have? Will it affect this person if I stop eating cheese and it helps my skin, or if I stop eating cheese and it, causes me to, have other bad things happen where I overindulge on other things in life because I can't have my cheese fix. You know how you replace cheese? Bacon. Does this person have a stake if I replace all my cheese with bacon? They do not, right? And then how are they feeling right now about being able to tell me that they don't eat cheese? It's interesting that I eat cheese, but they don't eat cheese. Now that's I want to be careful. When I use this, my intention really isn't to poke fun at the person. I'm not, trying to turn it into something that is mean. I really am trying to just hold up a mirror a little bit so that when I hear this advice, I really reflect it back to this person and ask these questions. And here's where this is really useful. What if that same conversation, maybe adjusted a little bit, happened in my doctor's office? And I'm at my doctor's office. And who is this person? My doctor. What's their relevant expertise? A doctor, right? What kind of stake do they have? Will it affect them if this does or doesn't work out? Yeah, I'm their patient. They do have a stake in this scenario. How are they feeling right now? Could this advice be? Maybe. That's why I love this question. It does help me when I talk to experts like doctors, and I'm trying to evaluate, how are they feeling right now? Is this new research that they're excited to be able to share? Do I need to consider that as I consider whether or not I take this advice? Or are they making it really collaborative? Are they kind of telling me that they think this, but how do I feel? Have I tried it before? That feels like a much more collaborative approach than bragging about new research. This has been really helpful for me. And hopefully as you see those two different examples, it helps to highlight the way that it also just slows down my fight or flight response, right? Instead of reacting to what that person says, I'm able to kind of flip it on them. Now, I want to emphasize again that this is something that works for me, but the biggest part of tonight was really about sharing this information with you and inviting you to reflect, to think about how this is showing up in your life, how you feel about it, and maybe thinking about some strategies that could work, this potentially being one of them, or thinking about other things that you want to try. My hope was to bring the conversation forward. Let's also remember, unfortunately, the whole world was not here tonight. So if this information was new to you, it might be new to other folks. I only say that because I don't want you to leave here and then as you're leaving, someone in the lobby says, oh, hey, you should really think about it. You're like, right? So since this information is new, you may notice advice for a little while. So just remember, now that we have this information, we can focus on doing better, on observing, but it's not something, unfortunately, that the whole world has heard yet. So we can work on that. I also want to emphasize again, I really think that you're amazing. I think that the women in this organization are doing incredible things. I'm so excited to continue following the chapter. And I just hope that what I've shared tonight, if anything, if it could help just a little bit as you feel more confident, as you lower your stress when you're in these different situations, as you learn to trust your gut and to say, good for you, not for me, more when you hear unsolicited advice, that would be worth the talk. So that's what I want to end with tonight. Thank you so much for walking through this journey with me, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you more in the workshop.